I never thought I would become the kind of man who checks his wife's phone while she sleeps. I never imagined I would spend my evenings cross-referencing appointment times with credit card statements or memorizing the exact duration of her therapy sessions down to the minute. But life has a way of teaching you things about yourself that you never wanted to learn, and betrayal has a way of transforming you into someone you barely recognize in the mirror. My name is Marcus, and this is the story of how I discovered that the man who was supposed to save my marriage was actually destroying it from the inside, and how I made absolutely certain that both of them paid for what they did to me, to my children, and to everything I had spent 15 years building. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the version of myself that still believed in the fundamental goodness of people, that still trusted his wife when she said she loved him, that still thought therapy was a sacred space where healing happened and boundaries were respected. Danielle and I met at a corporate conference in Chicago when I was 23 and she was 20. She was working as an assistant at a marketing firm, and I had just started my career in accounting at a mid-sized company in Boston. She had this laugh that cut through the noise of the crowded conference hall, and when she looked at me for the first time, I felt something shift in my chest that I had never experienced before. We dated long distance for 8 months before she transferred to a position in Boston. Within a year, we were engaged. Within 2 years, we were married in a small ceremony on Cape Cod with 60 of our closest friends and family. I remember standing at the altar watching her walk down the aisle, and I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. I remember believing, with every fiber of my being, that this woman would never hurt me. We built a beautiful life together. We bought a house in Lexington, a classic colonial with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for the children we planned to have. Danielle climbed the ladder at her marketing firm while I made partner at my accounting practice. When our daughter Emma was born, I cried for an hour straight, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the joy of becoming a father. 2 years later, our son Oliver arrived, and our family felt complete. For 12 years, I genuinely believed we were happy. I believed Danielle when she told me she loved me. I believed her when she said I was a good husband and a good father. I believed her when she complained about her stressful job and her difficult colleagues and her demanding clients. I believed her because I had no reason not to, because she was my wife, because we had built this life together, because I trusted her more than I trusted anyone else in the world. The cracks started appearing about 3 years ago, subtle things at first. Danielle seemed distracted at dinner, checking her phone more often than usual. She started going to bed later than me, claiming she had work emails to catch up on. The physical affection that had always flowed naturally between us began to feel forced, mechanical, like she was going through the motions of being a wife without actually wanting to be one. I told myself it was stress. Her firm had just landed a major client, and she was working 60-hour weeks. I told myself it was the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, that passion fades and evolves into something deeper and more comfortable. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative was too painful to consider. When Danielle suggested we try couples therapy, I was actually relieved. I saw it as a sign that she wanted to work on our marriage, that she recognized something was wrong and wanted to fix it. She had already researched therapists and found someone highly recommended, a Dr. Julian Harcourt, who specialized in couples counseling and had a practice in Cambridge. Our first session with Dr. Harcourt was in late September, almost exactly 3 years ago. I remember the leaves were just starting to turn, and there was a crispness in the air that felt like new beginnings. His office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brownstone, tastefully decorated with leather furniture and framed degrees on the walls. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm, measured voice that made you feel like he had all the answers. I liked him immediately. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened without judgment. He made both of us feel heard and validated. When Danielle cried during that first session, talking about how disconnected she felt from me, from our life, from herself, Dr. Harcourt handed her tissues and nodded with what seemed like genuine empathy. Looking back now, I realize how skilled he was, how carefully he cultivated trust, how methodically he positioned himself as our savior, the wise and compassionate guide who would lead us through the darkness and back into the light. I had no idea that the darkness he was leading us into was of his own creation. For the first 6 months, therapy seemed to help. Danielle and I were communicating better. We started having date nights again. We made an effort to reconnect physically. Dr. Harcourt gave us homework assignments that felt productive. He encouraged us to express our needs and to listen to each other without defensiveness. I left each session feeling hopeful, feeling like we were making progress, feeling like maybe our marriage could survive whatever was threatening to tear it apart. But somewhere around the 8-month mark, things began to shift again. Danielle started requesting individual sessions with Dr. Harcourt in addition to our couples sessions. She said she needed to work through some personal issues that were affecting her ability to be fully present in our marriage. It sounded reasonable. Therapists often recommend individual work alongside couples work. I didn't question it. I should have questioned it. The individual sessions started at 1 per week, then increased to 2. Danielle began seeing Dr. Harcourt more often than she saw me. She would come home from her Thursday evening appointments looking flushed, energized, different somehow. When I asked about her sessions, she would give vague answers about processing childhood trauma and working through anxiety. She said therapy was helping her become a better person, a better wife, a better mother. I wanted to believe her. So I did. The moment everything changed, the moment my entire world came crashing down around me, happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March of last year. I had come home early from work because of a canceled meeting, something that almost never happened. I wasn't sneaking around or looking for evidence of anything. I simply walked through the front door at 3:30 instead of 6 o'clock. Danielle's car wasn't in the driveway, which wasn't unusual. She often had client meetings that ran late. But what was unusual was the leather portfolio sitting on the kitchen counter. Danielle had a specific place for everything, and this portfolio definitely didn't belong there. I recognized it immediately as the one she brought to therapy appointments, the one where she kept her session notes and homework assignments. I don't know what made me open it. Maybe some buried instinct, some subconscious awareness that things weren't right. Maybe just curiosity about what she was working on in her individual sessions. I told myself I was just going to glance at it, that I wasn't violating her privacy, that married couples should be able to share everything. What I found inside changed my life forever. The portfolio contained a notebook filled with Danielle's handwriting. But these weren't therapy notes. These weren't reflections on her childhood or strategies for managing anxiety. These were love letters. Pages and pages of love letters addressed to Julian, written in my wife's hand, describing in explicit detail the affair they had been having for over a year. I stood in my kitchen, holding that notebook, and I felt my heart stop beating. I felt the floor drop out from under me. I felt 15 years of my life revealed as a lie, a construction built on sand, ready to collapse at the slightest pressure. The letters documented everything. The first time Julian kissed her during what was supposed to be an individual therapy session. The hotel rooms they started booking when the office wasn't private enough. The elaborate lies she told me about work trips and girls' nights and late meetings. The way Julian made her feel understood, desired, alive in ways I apparently never could. She wrote about their future together, about how Julian was going to leave his wife Rebecca once the timing was right, about how they would start a new life together, maybe in California or somewhere else far from Boston where no one would know their history. She wrote about how guilty she felt, but how the guilt was worth it because Julian was her soulmate, her true love, the person she was meant to be with all along. I read every single word. I forced myself to consume every painful detail because I needed to understand the full scope of the betrayal. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I decided what to do about it. The most devastating part wasn't the affair itself. Affairs happen. People are weak and selfish and make terrible choices. What destroyed me was the context. This wasn't some random coworker or an old flame from college. This was our therapist. The man we were paying $300 per session to help us fix our marriage was the same man who was systematically destroying it while sleeping with my wife. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it. I wiped my fingerprints off the leather portfolio. I walked to my home office, closed the door, and sat in silence for 3 hours until I heard Danielle's car pull into the driveway. When she came through the door, I greeted her the same way I always did. I asked about her day. I helped with dinner. I tucked the kids into bed. I lay next to her that night and listened to her breathing while my mind raced through every possible response to what I had discovered. Most men in my position would have confronted her immediately. They would have raged and screamed and thrown things. They would have packed bags or changed locks or called lawyers. But I am not most men. I am an accountant. I am trained to analyze situations methodically, to gather data, to understand the full picture before taking action. I am patient. I am thorough. And I was absolutely determined that when I finally made my move, it would be devastating, comprehensive, and completely irreversible. I gave myself 1 week to observe, 1 week to gather information, 1 week to transform from a heartbroken husband into something colder, something more calculated, something capable of dismantling the people who had betrayed me. During that week, I learned things that made the betrayal even worse. I discovered that Julian Harcourt had a pattern. He wasn't just having an affair with my wife. He had a history of relationships with vulnerable patients, women who came to him during their lowest moments and whom he systematically groomed for his own gratification. I found this out through careful research, through online forums where former patients shared their experiences anonymously, through whispered references in professional communities that I accessed through colleagues in the mental health field. Dr. Julian Harcourt was a predator, and my wife had walked right into his trap. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for Danielle. Part of me wanted to believe she was a victim, manipulated by a professional who knew exactly how to exploit her vulnerabilities. But then I would reread those love letters, those words written in her own hand, and I would remember that she had made choices. Every time she lied to me, she made a choice. Every time she walked into that hotel room, she made a choice. Every time she came home and kissed our children goodnight while the scent of another man was still on her skin, she made a choice. She didn't deserve my sympathy. She deserved consequences. I began building my case the way I would build any complex financial analysis, layer by layer, document by document. I photographed every page of that notebook with my phone and uploaded the images to a secure cloud account that Danielle didn't know existed. I started tracking her movements through the Find My app on our family account, noting every time she went somewhere that didn't match her stated schedule. I pulled our credit card statements going back 2 years and highlighted every suspicious charge, every lunch at a restaurant near Julian's office, every afternoon at a hotel that she never mentioned to me. The evidence was overwhelming. They had been careless because they thought they were safe. They thought I was the oblivious husband, too trusting and too naive to ever suspect that the therapy designed to save my marriage was actually a cover for my wife's affair with our therapist. But gathering evidence of the affair was only the first step. I didn't want a simple divorce. I didn't want to split our assets and argue over custody and watch them ride off into the sunset together while I rebuilt my shattered life. I wanted destruction. I wanted their careers, their reputations, their relationships, their carefully constructed facades to come crumbling down around them the way my world had crumbled down around me. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. Dr. Julian Harcourt was licensed by the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Psychologists. That license was the foundation of his career, his income, his professional identity. Without it, he was nothing. And there were very clear rules about what licensed therapists could and could not do with their patients. Having a sexual relationship with a current patient was grounds for immediate license revocation. It was a violation of the most fundamental ethical principle in mental health treatment. It was illegal in many contexts, and most importantly, it was documented extensively in the love letters sitting in my wife's portfolio. I started researching the complaint process. I learned that anyone could file a complaint with the licensing board. I learned that complaints triggered investigations. I learned that investigations could result in hearings, sanctions, suspensions, or permanent revocation. I learned that the process was confidential until a finding was made, which meant Julian wouldn't know who had reported him until it was too late. But I didn't file the complaint immediately. That would have been too simple, too direct. I wanted to approach this strategically. I wanted to hit them from multiple angles simultaneously, so that by the time they realized what was happening, there would be no escape, no damage control, no way to spin the narrative in their favor. I started with Rebecca Harcourt, Julian's wife. She was the first innocent victim in this situation, the person who had been betrayed just as surely as I had. She deserved to know the truth, but she also represented a powerful weapon if deployed correctly. I found her through social media. Her Facebook profile was mostly private, but her Instagram was public, filled with carefully curated photos of her perfect life with her perfect husband. Pictures of their home in Brookline, pictures of their two teenage children, pictures of Julian at various professional events, looking distinguished and trustworthy, looking like the kind of man who would never violate his patient's trust or destroy his family for an affair. I created an anonymous email account using a VPN to mask my location. I drafted a letter to Rebecca that was factual, measured, and undeniable. I included photographs of several pages from Danielle's notebook, the ones where she described her relationship with Julian in unmistakable terms. I included dates and locations of their hotel rendezvous, information I had verified through credit card records and location data. I included a screenshot from one of those anonymous forums where former patients discussed Julian's pattern of boundary violations. I didn't send the letter to Rebecca's personal email. That would have been too easy for Julian to intercept or explain away. Instead, I mailed a printed copy to her mother's house in Connecticut, addressed to Rebecca specifically, marked personal and confidential. I included a note suggesting that she verify this information before taking any action, and that she might want to consult with a lawyer before confronting her husband. I sent that letter on a Thursday, knowing it would arrive by Saturday. I gave Rebecca exactly 1 week to process the information before I took the next step. During that week, I watched Julian's behavior carefully through the lens of our ongoing therapy sessions. We still had appointments scheduled, sessions that I attended with a pleasant expression and a cooperative attitude while internally documenting every word he said for use in my eventual complaint. He seemed slightly distracted during our last session, slightly less composed than usual. I wondered if Rebecca had already confronted him, if the first domino had already begun to fall. After that week passed, I filed my complaint with the Massachusetts Board of Registration of Psychologists. I spent hours crafting the document, making sure it was thorough, specific, and supported by evidence. I attached copies of relevant pages from the notebook. I included a timeline of our therapy sessions overlaid with evidence of the affair. I referenced the anonymous reports from other patients, suggesting that the board might want to investigate a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. The complaint was filed on a Monday morning. That same day, I consulted with 3 different divorce attorneys before selecting the one who seemed most aggressive and most experienced in cases involving infidelity and custody disputes. Her name was Victoria Chen, and she had a reputation for dismantling unfaithful spouses in court. Victoria's eyes widened as I laid out my evidence. She had seen a lot in her career, but she admitted that the therapist angle was particularly egregious. She explained my options, the potential outcomes, the likely timeline. She told me that in Massachusetts, infidelity could influence the division of assets if it could be shown that marital funds were used to support the affair. She told me that courts looked unfavorably on parents who demonstrated poor judgment and moral character. She told me that I had a very strong case for primary custody of Emma and Oliver. I asked Victoria to hold off on filing divorce papers for exactly 3 weeks. I needed that time to ensure that all the other pieces were in place before Danielle knew what was coming. During those 3 weeks, I was the perfect husband. I was attentive, affectionate, supportive. I complimented Danielle on her appearance and thanked her for everything she did for our family. I suggested weekend activities and planned a special dinner for our anniversary. Danielle seemed confused by my behavior at first, then pleased, then slightly suspicious. I assured her that therapy was really working, that I felt closer to her than I had in years, that I was optimistic about our future. Every word was a lie, and every lie tasted like justice. I used those 3 weeks to gather additional evidence. I cloned Danielle's phone one night while she slept, using software I purchased from a cybersecurity firm that marketed to concerned parents. The clone gave me access to her text messages, her emails, her photos, her calendar. What I found confirmed everything in the notebook and revealed even more. Danielle and Julian communicated through a messaging app that promised encrypted disappearing messages, but the app had a feature that allowed users to save important conversations to their device. Danielle, apparently, considered many of their conversations important enough to save. I downloaded hundreds of messages spanning over 18 months, messages planning their meetings, messages professing their love, messages discussing their future together and the obstacles in the way, including me and Julian's wife. One conversation in particular stood out. It was from about 2 months earlier, when Julian had apparently gotten nervous about the risks they were taking. He suggested they cool things down, maybe take a break until he could figure out how to leave Rebecca without losing everything in a divorce. Danielle's response was telling. She didn't accept his suggestion gracefully. She threatened to expose the affair herself if he tried to abandon her. She reminded him that she had documentation of everything, that she could destroy his career with a single phone call to the licensing board, that he was in far too deep to walk away now. My wife was not just an adulteress, she was a blackmailer. She had trapped Julian in the affair just as surely as he had manipulated her into it. They deserved each other. I also discovered, during those 3 weeks of surveillance, that Danielle had been systematically transferring money from our joint accounts into a personal account that I hadn't known existed. Small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there, but the transfers had increased in recent months. By my calculation, she had moved almost $40,000 into this hidden account. Money that she was probably planning to use when she finally left me for Julian. I documented every transfer. I calculated the exact amounts. I added this financial betrayal to the mountain of evidence I was building. When the 3 weeks were up, I received confirmation that the licensing board had opened a formal investigation into Dr. Julian Harcourt. The notice was sent to Julian, informing him of the complaint and requesting his cooperation with the investigation. I knew this because his demeanor changed dramatically at our next therapy session. He was pale, distracted, barely able to maintain his professional composure. He cut the session short, claiming he wasn't feeling well. Danielle was clearly concerned. She asked me on the drive home if I had noticed anything different about Julian, if he seemed okay. I said I hadn't noticed anything particular. She spent that evening on her phone, probably trying to reach Julian, probably panicking about what the investigation might uncover. The next morning, I told Victoria to file the divorce papers. Danielle was served at her office in front of her colleagues. I had requested that specifically. I wanted her to feel the humiliation of having her personal life exposed in her professional environment, the same way she had humiliated me by conducting an affair under the guise of therapy that I was paying for. She came home that evening shaking with rage. She demanded to know what was happening, why I was doing this, whether I had lost my mind. I remained calm. I told her that I knew everything. I told her that I had known for months. I told her that the divorce papers were just the beginning. The look on her face when she realized the extent of my knowledge was something I will never forget. The color drained from her skin. Her hands trembled. Her voice cracked as she tried to defend herself, to explain, to minimize what she had done. She said it wasn't what I thought. She said Julian had manipulated her. She said she had been going through something and made mistakes, but she still loved me. She still wanted our family. She was willing to work on things. I let her talk. I let her dig herself deeper into her web of lies. And then I told her about the complaint I had filed with the licensing board. I told her about the letter I had sent to Rebecca Harcourt. I told her about the cloned phone and the saved messages and the hidden bank account. I watched her face cycle through shock, fear, anger, and finally something that might have been respect, the recognition that the man she had dismissed as oblivious and controllable had been 10 steps ahead of her the entire time. That night, Danielle moved into the guest room. The following week, she moved out entirely, into an apartment that her parents helped her find. She tried to take the children with her, but I had already filed for emergency temporary custody, based on evidence of her relationship with a mental health professional who was currently under investigation for ethics violations. The judge granted my request, citing concerns about Danielle's judgment and the potential instability of her living situation. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The initial phase of my plan had succeeded, but I was far from finished. The licensing board investigation took approximately 4 months. During that time, Julian was required to cease practicing while the investigation was ongoing. His income dried up. His partnership at the practice dissolved. His colleagues unwilling to associate with someone facing such serious allegations. Rebecca Harcourt filed for divorce, taking their children and moving back to Connecticut to be near her family. I monitored all of this from a distance, gathering information through public records and through the network of contacts I had developed during my months of research. I learned that Julian had hired an expensive attorney to represent him before the licensing board. I learned that he was claiming the relationship with Danielle was consensual and that she had been the pursuer, not him. I learned that he was trying to paint himself as the victim of a seductive patient who had manipulated him. This narrative did not go well for him. The board had received not just my complaint, but several others from former patients who came forward once they learned about the investigation. Women who had been too afraid or too ashamed to speak up before now felt empowered to share their experiences. A pattern emerged, a clear history of Julian exploiting vulnerable women who came to him for help. The hearing was held in September, almost exactly 1 year after my world had fallen apart. I was called to testify, to describe my experience as Julian's patient, and to authenticate the evidence I had provided. I sat across from Julian in that hearing room and looked him directly in the eyes as I detailed how he had violated my trust, my marriage, and his professional obligations. He couldn't meet my gaze. He stared at the table in front of him while his attorney made half-hearted objections and the board members took notes. When it was Julian's turn to speak, he offered a rambling defense that convinced no one. He tried to blame Danielle. He tried to blame the stress of his profession. He tried to blame everything and everyone except himself. The board deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their decision. Dr. Julian Harcourt's license was permanently revoked. He was prohibited from practicing psychology in Massachusetts or any state with reciprocity agreements. He was referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to his conduct with patients. I walked out of that hearing room and stood on the steps of the government building, breathing in the September air. It was exactly 1 year since I had first sat in Julian's office, full of hope that he could help save my marriage. Now his career was over, his reputation destroyed, his family scattered. But there was still the matter of my divorce, and the matter of Danielle. The divorce proceedings were brutal, but ultimately one-sided. Victoria Chen was as aggressive as promised, presenting evidence of Danielle's infidelity, her financial deception, and her relationship with a man now proven to be a serial predator of vulnerable patients. Danielle's attorney tried to argue that she was a victim, that Julian had taken advantage of her emotional vulnerability during a difficult time in our marriage. But the saved messages told a different story. The blackmail threats she had made to Julian told a different story. The hidden bank account told a different story. The judge was not sympathetic to Danielle. In his ruling, he cited her breach of marital trust, her financial misconduct, and her demonstrated poor judgment in associating with an individual whose professional misconduct was now a matter of public record. I was awarded primary custody of Emma and Oliver, with Danielle receiving supervised visitation pending a psychological evaluation. The division of assets favored me significantly, taking into account the funds Danielle had improperly transferred and the marital resources that had been used to facilitate her affair. Danielle's career also suffered. The divorce was technically private, but in the age of social media, nothing stays private for long. Word spread through her professional community about her relationship with Julian, about the circumstances of her divorce, about the custody ruling that questioned her fitness as a mother. She was quietly pushed out of her position at the marketing firm, her colleagues unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Last I heard, she was working at a much smaller agency for a fraction of her previous salary. I wish I could say that I felt triumphant throughout all of this. I wish I could say that watching Danielle and Julian face consequences for their actions brought me satisfaction and closure. But the truth is more complicated than that. There were nights, many nights, when I lay awake questioning everything I had done, questioning whether my revenge had been proportionate or excessive, questioning whether I had destroyed 2 people who were flawed but not evil, broken but not irredeemable, questioning what kind of man I had become in my pursuit of justice. The guilt was especially strong when I thought about the collateral damage. Rebecca Harcourt had lost her marriage and her sense of security because of my letter. Julian's teenage children had lost their father's reputation and stability because of my complaint. Even my own children, Emma and Oliver, had lost their intact family, their mother's daily presence, their sense that the adults in their lives were trustworthy and stable. I told myself that the truth would have emerged eventually, that I was simply accelerating an inevitable collapse. I told myself that Rebecca deserved to know what kind of man she was married to, that Julian's children deserved to understand why their father wasn't who they thought he was. I told myself that Emma and Oliver were better off with a single father who was honest and present than with 2 parents trapped in a marriage built on lies. Some days, I believed these things. Other days, I wondered if I had simply convinced myself that vengeance was justice, that cruelty was righteousness, that destroying other people's lives was acceptable as long as they had hurt me first. The turning point in my emotional recovery came about 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I was attending a support group for divorced parents, something my own therapist had recommended. Yes, I eventually went back to therapy, though I was extremely careful about selecting a female therapist with impeccable credentials and decades of experience. During one of these support group sessions, I met a woman named Patricia who was recovering from her own devastating divorce. Patricia's story was different from mine in the specifics, but similar in the emotional landscape. Her husband had left her for his secretary, a cliché so mundane it was almost insulting. She had spent years afterward consumed by anger and resentment, unable to move forward because she was so focused on the injustice of what had been done to her. Then, gradually, she had begun to heal. She had begun to rebuild. She had begun to understand that her ex-husband's choices were about his own brokenness, not about her worth as a person. Listening to Patricia, I realized that I had reached a similar crossroads. I could continue to define myself by what Danielle and Julian had done to me, or I could begin to define myself by what I chose to do going forward. I could remain a victim seeking perpetual revenge, or I could become something else entirely. I chose to become something else. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear. There were setbacks and regressions. There were moments when I would see Danielle at a custody exchange and feel the old rage bubbling up, the desire to say something cutting, something that would remind her of everything she had lost. But I learned to let those moments pass. I learned to breathe through them and focus on what mattered, which was being a good father to Emma and Oliver, being present and stable and trustworthy in their lives. Emma was 10 when the divorce was finalized. Oliver was 8. They were old enough to sense that something terrible had happened, but young enough to be protected from the full truth. I told them that their mother and I had grown apart, that we couldn't make each other happy anymore, that we both still loved them very much. I didn't poison them against Danielle, despite the temptation. I didn't burden them with details they were too young to process. This restraint was perhaps my greatest act of self-control throughout the entire ordeal. Every instinct screamed at me to ensure that Emma and Oliver knew what their mother had done, that they understood who was the villain and who was the victim. But I realized that making them choose sides would only hurt them more. They needed to maintain a relationship with their mother, complicated as it might be. They needed to believe that both of their parents loved them and had their best interests at heart. So I bit my tongue. I facilitated visitation. I spoke neutrally about Danielle in front of the children. I became the bigger person, not because she deserved it, but because Emma and Oliver deserved it. As the months passed, and then the years, I watched my children adapt and eventually thrive. Emma threw herself into academics and developed a passion for marine biology that surprised everyone, including herself. Oliver discovered a talent for music, learning guitar with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They made friends, navigated the awkwardness of having divorced parents, grew into remarkable young people despite the upheaval of their early years. I also began to rebuild my own life. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the final years of my marriage. I took up running, completing my first half marathon at age 40. I traveled to places I had always wanted to visit, taking the kids to Costa Rica and Iceland and Japan. I eventually started dating again, cautiously at first, then with more openness as I learned to trust my own judgment. Through all of this, I kept loose track of what happened to Danielle and Julian. Not through active surveillance anymore, just through the occasional piece of information that made its way to me through mutual acquaintances or public records. Julian never recovered professionally. Without his license, he couldn't practice therapy anywhere in the country. He tried to reinvent himself as a life coach, one of those unlicensed advisors who offer guidance without the regulatory oversight of a licensed profession. But his history followed him. Every time he started to build a client base, someone would discover who he really was, and the Whisper Network would do its work. Last I heard, he was working as a customer service representative at a company that sold insurance software. His criminal case never went anywhere. The district attorney determined that while Julian's behavior was egregious, it didn't meet the specific legal thresholds for prosecution in Massachusetts. He avoided jail time, but lost everything else that mattered to him: his career, his marriage, his reputation, his financial security. Danielle's trajectory was more complicated. After losing her high-powered job, she struggled for several years with depression, and what I later learned was a serious drinking problem. She missed visitation sessions. She showed up to custody exchanges looking disheveled and unwell. For a while, I genuinely worried about whether she would survive her own self-destruction. Then slowly, she began to put herself back together. She entered treatment for her alcoholism. She started therapy, real therapy this time, with a licensed professional who helped her understand the patterns of behavior that had led her to such a destructive place. She got a new job, modest but stable. She became more reliable with the children, more present and engaged during their time together. I won't pretend that I rooted for her recovery. The wounds she had inflicted were too deep for me to wish her genuine happiness. But I recognized that her improvement was good for Emma and Oliver, that they needed their mother to be functional and present, even if she would never again be the person they had believed her to be. About 2 years ago, something happened that forced me to reckon with the full complexity of what I had done and what had been done to me. Danielle asked if we could meet privately, without lawyers or children, just the two of us. I was skeptical, but curious. We met at a coffee shop near my office, choosing a public place where neither of us would be tempted to lose control. She looked different than I remembered. Older, obviously, but also more subdued. The sharp edges that had defined her personality throughout our marriage seemed softened, worn down by experience and reflection. She ordered a green tea and wrapped her hands around the cup as if seeking warmth. For a few minutes, we made awkward small talk about the children, about work, about nothing in particular. Then she took a deep breath and said what she had come to say. She apologized, not the defensive, qualified apology she had offered in the immediate aftermath of the discovery, not the manipulative apology designed to minimize her actions and shift blame, a real apology. She acknowledged what she had done. She acknowledged the pain she had caused. She acknowledged that I had every right to hate her, that my response had been proportionate to her betrayal, that she had no excuses and expected no forgiveness. She told me that she understood finally how broken she had been during those years, how unhappy she was in our marriage not because of anything I had done, but because of something missing inside herself, how she had sought validation and excitement and proof of her own worth in the most destructive possible way, how Julian had seemed like an escape until he became a prison. She told me about the blackmail, how she had panicked when Julian tried to end things, how she had threatened him out of desperation rather than any calculated plan. She told me about the hidden bank account, how it had started as a small nest egg for emergencies and grown into something more sinister as her fantasies about a different life became more elaborate. She told me about the guilt she carried, not just about the affair, but about how she had treated me throughout our marriage, dismissing my contributions, taking my stability for granted, always wanting something more without being able to articulate what more actually meant. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to decide how to respond. Part of me wanted to accept her apology, to offer forgiveness, to release both of us from the weight we had been carrying. Part of me wanted to reject it entirely, to tell her that words couldn't undo what she had done, that she didn't deserve my absolution. In the end, I chose something in between. I told her that I heard her, that I appreciated her willingness to take responsibility, that I recognized the effort it must have taken to reach this point in her healing. I told her that I didn't know if I would ever fully forgive her, that some wounds leave scars that never completely fade. But I also told her that I was no longer angry, that I had let go of my desire for her to suffer, that I wished her whatever peace she could find. She cried. I didn't, but I came close. We shook hands when we parted, a gesture that felt both inadequate and appropriate given everything we had been to each other. Walking back to my office after that meeting, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I was carrying. Not the wound itself, which would always be part of my story, but the infection that had surrounded it, the poison of ongoing resentment, the weight of perpetual victimhood. I had spent years defining myself by what Danielle and Julian had done to me. Now, finally, I was ready to define myself by something else. Looking back now, with almost 4 years of distance from that terrible discovery in my kitchen, I can see my story with more clarity and nuance than I could in the immediate aftermath. I can see that I was both victim and aggressor, both justified and excessive. I can see that my revenge, while emotionally satisfying, came with costs I hadn't fully anticipated. The licensing board complaint was appropriate and necessary. Julian Harcourt was a predator who had violated the most sacred trust between therapist and patient. He needed to be stopped. The other women who came forward after my complaint proved that his behavior was a pattern, not an aberration. By speaking up, I protected future patients from becoming his victims. The letter to Rebecca Harcourt was more complicated. She deserved to know the truth about her husband, but there might have been kinder ways to deliver that truth. I could have approached her directly rather than sending an anonymous letter. I could have given her more support and resources as she processed the revelation. I could have considered her humanity rather than viewing her solely as a strategic asset in my campaign of destruction. The divorce tactics were aggressive but legally sound. Victoria Chen played within the rules, exploiting every advantage that Danielle's behavior provided. If the outcome felt punitive, it was because Danielle's actions had been punitive toward me and our family. Courts are designed to consider these factors, and the judge's ruling reflected his assessment of the evidence. The surveillance was the piece I struggled with most in retrospect. Cloning Danielle's phone without her knowledge was ethically questionable, even if it wasn't technically illegal in Massachusetts given our marriage. I justified it at the time as necessary intelligence gathering, but I knew even then that I was crossing lines I would normally consider inviolable. I rationalized that her deception justified mine, but two wrongs never actually make a right. What I learned from all of this, the lesson that took years to fully absorb, was that revenge is a double-edged sword. It can provide satisfaction and justice. It can rebalance scales that were tilted unfairly against you. But it also changes you. It forces you to become someone capable of inflicting pain, someone who makes calculated decisions about how to maximize another person's suffering. I don't regret what I did. Given the same circumstances, I would probably make similar choices. But I understand now that those choices came with a price, and I have to live with that price for the rest of my life. Emma is 15 now, Oliver is 13. They are navigating high school and puberty and the endless complexity of adolescence. They have questions about what happened between their parents, questions they couldn't articulate when they were younger, but now need to understand. I have begun to tell them the truth, gradually and age-appropriately, without demonizing their mother or glorifying myself. Emma, in particular, has struggled with what she's learned. She remembers her mother from before the divorce, remembers the love and stability she thought she had, and reconciling that memory with the truth of what Danielle did has been painful for her. She went through a period of refusing to see Danielle at all, then gradually resumed their relationship on her own terms. Now they have something that resembles friendship, guarded but genuine. Oliver has been more pragmatic about the whole situation. He takes after me in that way, processing things internally and focusing on what can be controlled rather than what cannot be changed. He maintains separate relationships with Danielle and me, compartmentalizing effectively in a way that I both admire and worry about. I am dating someone now, a woman named Jennifer, who I met through a mutual friend about 18 months ago. She knows my full history, has read the court documents and heard the story from my perspective. She accepts all of it, including the parts that don't reflect well on me. We are talking about moving in together, about building a future that includes her daughter from a previous marriage and my children in some kind of blended arrangement. I am not the same person I was before the betrayal. I am more guarded now, slower to trust, more aware of the capacity for deception that exists in everyone, including myself. But I am also stronger, more resilient, more certain of my own values and boundaries. I know now that I am capable of surviving the worst thing I could imagine, and that knowledge gives me a foundation I didn't have before. If there is a lesson in my story, it might be this. Betrayal by someone you love is one of the deepest wounds a person can suffer, but it does not have to define you forever. You can choose how you respond. You can choose whether to become a perpetual victim or someone who rises from the ashes of their former life. You can choose to seek justice without losing yourself in the process, though this balance is harder to maintain than any self-help book would have you believe. Julian Harcourt took advantage of vulnerable people who came to him for help. He deserved to lose his license and his career. Danielle chose to participate in the destruction of our marriage while pretending to work on saving it. She deserved to face consequences for that choice. But they are also human beings, flawed and broken and capable of suffering just like I am. Understanding this doesn't excuse what they did, but it prevents me from becoming the kind of monster I swore I would never be. The therapy notes that Danielle kept, those love letters I discovered in her portfolio on that Tuesday afternoon, are still saved in my cloud account. I have never deleted them. Sometimes, on difficult days, I pull them up and read a few passages. Not to rekindle my anger, not to refresh my sense of victimhood, but to remind myself of how far I have come. Those notes represent the worst moment of my life, but they also represent the beginning of a journey that made me who I am today. A journey from blind trust, through devastating betrayal, through calculated revenge, into something that resembles peace. I am not grateful for what happened. I would not wish it on anyone. But I am no longer consumed by it. I have taken the wreckage of my marriage and built something new from the rubble. Not perfect, not unblemished, but mine. A life that I chose, rather than one that was chosen for me. The therapist who was supposed to save my marriage was actually destroying it. But in the end, I was the one who got to define how the story ended. I let the truth destroy them both, and then I learned to stop letting their destruction define my existence. That is my revenge, not the licensing complaint or the divorce settlement or the letters that exposed their secrets, but the simple fact that I survived what they did to me and became a better person despite it. They tried to break me, and for a while they succeeded. But I put myself back together, piece by piece, year by year, and now I stand in the life I rebuilt with my children beside me and my future ahead of me. The betrayal is part of my story, but it is not my whole story. Not anymore. And that, more than any court ruling or professional sanction, is the justice I claimed for myself.